Imagine the neon green liquid glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights of a Tokyo convenience store. You reach for the familiar, thirst-quenching bottle, a taste of home in a foreign land, but the shelf is empty. It's not sold here because the very formula that makes it glow is considered a dangerous poison. Japan, a nation famed for its rigorous standards of purity and health, rejected the vibrant syrup decades ago. The chilling question is not why they banned it, but why we still allowed it to be sold openly on our own shelves for so long. Subscribe to this channel now if you want to uncover the bitter truth behind the sweet facade of mass-market convenience. Let me know in the comments right now, what is the one ingredient you suspect is lurking in your favorite snack? Because the chemical secret hidden inside that bottle is linked to substances used to fight fire, not quench thirst. You have been drinking a legal low-dose mixture of a chemical cousin to flame retardants, and your body has been storing it. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on the poison scandal that divided the world and finally forced a change in the West. The fizzy, intensely sweet scent of synthetic citrus hangs heavy in the air, a scent so sharp it almost stings the back of your throat, perfectly mimicking a hyper-realized lemon lime that nature never intended. This is the sensory signature of Mountain Dew, a beverage that has defined generations of American consumption, particularly among the youth drawn to its electric color and the relentless, driving rush of its high caffeine, high sugar content, positioning itself as a fuel for extreme action and non-stop energy. The visual appeal? A vibrant, almost radioactive yellow-green, is intentionally arresting, designed to dominate the muted palette of natural beverages and scream for attention from the chilled glass doors of every refrigerator case across the nation. Yet, this exact chromatic intensity and sensory profile, the very things that made it a cultural icon in one part of the world, rendered it untouchable and illegal in others, a striking example of a radical divergence in global food safety philosophy. Stepping into a bustling, impeccably organized supermarket in Tokyo, a consumer expecting to find this neon American staple would encounter only absence, a deliberate, regulatory void where Mountain Dew's domestic formula simply could not exist due to a strict, non-negotiable legal framework. The Japanese regulatory agencies, operating under a principle of extreme caution and prioritizing public health above commercial convenience, drew a hard line in the sand against a specific, innocuous-sounding emulsifier central to the drink's very stability. This rejection by Japan, enforced with the quiet, rigid efficiency of their legal system since 2010, was a direct and definitive judgment on the ingredients permissible for mass consumption, sending a subtle yet profound message back across the Pacific. It highlighted an unsettling asymmetry. The very product deemed safe enough for daily intake by millions of Americans, from children to adults, was classified overseas as a problematic substance, a outright violation of fundamental food safety tenets. The immediate and primary trigger for this global separation was the presence of brominated vegetable oil, or BVO, an additive that played a silent technical role in the drink's chemistry but carried a massive toxicological shadow that governments outside of the United States refused to ignore. BVO's chemical function is purely aesthetic and structural, a master of density that ensures the delicate citrus flavor oils, which are less dense than water, do not separate and float unappealingly to the surface of the carbonated liquid. Without BVO, the vivid orange and lemon essences would form a greasy, visible ring at the neck of the bottle, signaling a clear separation and dramatically reducing the product's shelf stability and visual marketing appeal. A corporate nightmare. The oil, chemically modified by atoms of the element bromine bonded to its fat molecules, is a testament to industrial food science, creating a perfect suspension, a homogeneous texture that maintains the desired mouthfeel and the consistent, opaque coloring the consumer expects. However, the introduction of bromine, a pungent, deep red, oily chemical element more often associated with laboratory equipment and industrial applications than with edible substances, is precisely where the poison scandal narrative begins to crystallize and take hold of the public consciousness. Bromine itself, a heavy halogen, is the controversial link. Chemically related to the components found in flame retardants used to slow or stop the spread of fire in plastics, textiles, and building materials, a terrifying mental jump for any consumer reading a label. This association, though not a perfect parallel in its final compound form, created an indelible public image of a chemical that accumulates in the body, a silent, corrosive intruder that slowly chips away at the consumer's long-term health. The fear surrounding BVO wasn't merely theoretical. Early animal studies dating back to the late 1960s had already raised serious flags about its bioaccumulation, suggesting that the compound did not fully pass through the body but left chemical residues. These brominated triglycerides, the toxic legacy of consumption, were found to deposit themselves in fatty tissue throughout the body, particularly settling in the liver, the heart, the brain, and body fat, suggesting a slow-acting, cumulative exposure hazard rather than an acute, immediate poison. It was this creeping, invisible accumulation over a lifetime of soda consumption that truly alarmed international regulatory bodies, especially in regions that favor the precautionary principle in health and safety. The documented case of bromism, though rare and often associated with massive extreme consumptions, such as a specific instance where a man drinking several liters of BVO-containing soda daily developed severe served as a terrifying clinical proof point for the substance's inherent danger. His symptoms were horrific and included severe memory loss, uncontrollable tremors, chronic fatigue, a noticeable loss of muscle coordination, and persistent headaches, clear indicators of damage to the central nervous system caused by excessive bromine accumulation. While mainstream, moderate consumption might not lead to such immediate and dramatic results, the case acted as a chilling, sensationalized beacon, demonstrating the catastrophic potential of the ingredient when its concentration tipped past a certain unknown physiological limit. The fundamental ethical question that this case, and the continued use of BVO, forced onto the Western public conversation was chillingly simple. Why, when safe, proven alternatives like sucrose, acetate, isobutyrate, SABE, or glycerol ester of wood, rosin already existed, and were being used by the very same companies in their non-American market products. Was the potentially harmful chemical still retained in the domestic U.S. formula? This disparity revealed a powerful, often hidden regulatory environment that prioritized commercial flexibility and outdated governmental bureaucracy over the immediate, proactive protection of millions of citizens, contrasting starkly with the swift, decisive actions of Japan and Europe. Japan's ban in 2010, which followed the European Union's own prohibition in 2008, and India's ban as far back as 1990. Established a clear line of global consensus that the U.S. chose for decades to actively ignore, relying instead on a 50-year-old regulatory classification. The ingredient had been briefly listed by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration (FDA) in the late 1950s as generally recognized as safe grass, a classification designed for common, obviously safe ingredients like salt or vinegar, which allowed manufacturers to use it without rigorous, repeated safety review. However, after toxicity concerns emerged in the late 1960s, the FDA withdrew the GRAS status, but crucially did not ban it outright, instead classifying it as an interim food additive with a concentration limit of 15 parts per million ppm. This interim status, intended to be temporary while more studies were conducted, became a regulatory fossil, a legal loophole that allowed Mountain Dew and several other citrus-flavored products to continue using BVO for over 50 years in the American market, long after the rest of the developed world had moved on. It represented a profound philosophical difference in risk assessment. While Japan and Europe embraced the precautionary principle, demanding proof of safety before introduction, the U.S. system essentially placed the burden of proof on the public or independent researchers to prove harm after the substance was already widespread. This passive regulation allowed the ingredient to become deeply embedded in the consumer psyche and the corporate supply chain, making removal a massive, costly logistical undertaking that companies resisted fiercely for years. The resulting legal and regulatory inaction transformed the issue from a purely chemical problem into a potent symbol of corporate inertia and governmental stagnation, fueling a powerful grassroots consumer movement that gained immense traction in the early 2010s. Online petitions, organized by health advocates and environmental groups, began to gain hundreds of thousands of signatures, explicitly demanding that major manufacturers like PepsiCo remove BVO from their flagship products, citing the obvious double standard of selling a safer formula abroad while keeping the older, controversial one at home. The sheer undeniable fact that ABVO-free Mountain Dew existed in countries like Canada, which phased it out alongside the UK's early ban, made the manufacturer's domestic position utterly indefensible and eventually forced a grudging, highly public concession from the giants of the soft drink industry. The pressure reached an undeniable crescendo, driven by a growing, educated populace that was no longer satisfied with vague corporate assurances and demanded ingredients lists that matched international standards, mirroring a broader cultural shift toward clean eating and transparency. PepsiCo finally announced in 2014 that it would begin phasing out BVO from Gatorade and eventually Mountain Dew. A major symbolic victory for consumer advocacy that showed the power of public opinion to override decades of regulatory inertia and corporate preference. This move was framed by the company as a response to consumer preference rather than an admission of guilt, a strategic maneuver to preserve brand loyalty while quietly aligning their formula with the global health standards that Japan had enforced years earlier. However, the final chapter of the BVO saga played out much more recently, culminating in a definitive federal reckoning that retrospectively validated the conservative stance of nations like Japan. In a monumental public health victory, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration (FDA), responding to modern, robust studies conducted in collaboration with the National Institutes of Health (NIH), which confirmed BVO's potential to negatively affect the thyroid and accumulate in tissue, finally proposed a total ban in late 2023. The agency explicitly stated that the scientific evidence no longer supported the conclusion that BVO was safe for its intended use, effectively erasing the interim status that had artificially prolonged its life in the American food supply for half a century. This decisive action solidified on July 3, 2024, when the FDA issued a final rule revoking the regulation, with the ban officially taking effect in August 2024, granting companies one final year to clear their inventories and fully reformulate their beverages. The date itself became a marker of a generational shift, signifying the end of an era where a controversial bromine-based chemical one that had been the subject of global bans since 1970 in the UK and 2010 in Japan was legally allowed to be sold in America. The long-awaited decision brought the US into alignment with its international peers, finally closing the regulatory gap that had defined the Mountain Dew ban narrative for years. This federal move was preceded and further motivated by powerful, forward-thinking state action, notably in California, which became the first U.S. state to legislatively ban BVO, along with 3 other controversial additives: potassium bromate, propylpropan, and Red 3 through the California Food Safety Act in 2023. This law, set to take effect in 2027, created an immediate, powerful market signal that forced national companies to consider reformulation not just for export, but for their largest domestic market, demonstrating the potential for state governments to act as a crucial check when federal agencies are slow to respond to mounting scientific evidence. The law was celebrated as a necessary step to protect consumers from chemicals that had long been deemed unsafe by the majority of the developed world. The long shadow of the Mountain Dew ban and the BVO scandal fundamentally reshaped the public's relationship with soft drinks, forcing a deeper and more critical examination of what we consume and the silent compromises made by regulatory bodies. It revealed a deeply fractured global food safety system, where the health of one population could be prioritized over another based purely on geographic borders and the strength of corporate lobbying. Today, the core lesson for consumers is perpetual vigilance. Even if a major brand like Mountain Dew has removed BVO from its current production, runs a move largely completed years ago, the regulatory history of this one chemical serves as a cautionary tale about the need to scrutinize every ingredient and demand the same level of safety enjoyed by consumers in Tokyo, London, or Mumbai. While Mountain Dew may now be generally safe from the BVO perspective, the drink's legacy as a controversial symbol remains. A neon reminder of the decades when Americans were consuming a product deemed too hazardous for much of the world. It's a testament to the fact that while the poison may be gone, the system that allowed it to persist, the reliance on outdated grass rules, and the slow pace of federal health intervention still requires critical examination and reform. The battle over BVO was not just about a single emulsifier, it was a defining fight over the very definition of safe in the industrial food age. The vibrant electric color that once captivated millions now carries a subtle, lingering historical sting, reminding us that the brightest, most artificial hues often hide the most unsettling chemical stories. The soft drink, once a simple pleasure, is now a complex symbol of global regulatory failure and eventual, hard-won consumer success. It prompts us all to remember that health is not guaranteed by law. It must be actively defended through informed choice and persistent advocacy, ensuring that what's sold here is no less safe than what is deemed acceptable anywhere else in the world. Finally, honoring the cautionary lead taken by Japan over a decade ago. The true victory is not just a reformulated soda, but a permanently raised standard of expectation for every label we read. The philosophical differences between the food safety doctrines of the East and the West are perhaps nowhere more clearly delineated than in the saga of this single, controversial additive, which perfectly crystallized the chasm. Japan, with its deep-seated cultural reverence for purity and natural ingredients, viewed the inclusion of a chemical cousin to a flame retardant in a children's beverage as an unacceptable risk, regardless of the quantity. This approach, rooted in the Shokawiku food education movement and a general distrust of highly processed, industrially stabilized foods, contrasts sharply with the American regulatory history that often privileges economic viability and scientific certainty of harm before mandating withdrawal. The Japanese decision in 2010 was not a sudden, knee-jerk reaction, but the culmination of a systematic, decades-long process of risk assessment that consistently flagged BVO as an undesirable and unnecessary component in their national diet. Their regulatory bodies considered not just the immediate toxicity, but the long-term cumulative effects of low-dose exposure across an entire population, especially vulnerable groups like pregnant women and children whose developing systems are highly susceptible to endocrine disruptors. This conservative stance meant that for years, any attempt to import the U.S. version of Mountain Dew was immediately blocked at the border, enforcing a zero-tolerance policy that protected their citizens from the bioaccumulative risks that American drinkers were still passively absorbing. The vibrant, almost glowing liquid of the American Mountain Dew bottle, when placed next to a Japanese soft drink often clearer, lighter in color, and featuring natural stabilizers becomes a powerful visual metaphor for two opposing worldviews on food science. One view embraces chemical innovation as a tool for commercial longevity and intense sensory experience. The other seeks to minimize chemical intervention, prioritizing the perceived integrity of the natural ingredients, accepting a shorter shelf life or a less aggressive color palette as a necessary trade-off for purity. The ban was a cultural statement, an official declaration that this particular strain of American food industry practice would not be welcomed onto their shores. The sheer difficulty of the scientific community in pinning down a definitive, irrefutable safe level for BVO was what ultimately doomed its use in the more cautious regulatory environments. Because the substance accumulates in fat, the potential for individual variation and toxicity based on body weight, metabolic rate, and total soft drink consumption made it impossible to set a single, universally protective limit that eliminated all long-term risk for every citizen. Japan's regulators recognized that an ingredient that bioaccumulates and is difficult to metabolize poses an existential threat to population health, a time bomb that may only reveal its true danger years or even generations after its initial consumption. The contrast between the calm, decisive Japanese ban and the drawn-out, highly political battle in the United States highlights the fundamental flaw in the FDA's interim additive status, which was essentially an agreement to wait for definitive proof of widespread harm before acting decisively. This legal purgatory allowed soft drink companies to continue profiting from a cheaper, controversial emulsifier, effectively delaying a necessary, expensive reformulation until public outcry became too loud to ignore. It took consumer boycotts, viral petitions, and the highly publicized legislative action of a single state, California, to finally force the federal government to close the loophole that industry had exploited for over 50 years. The eventual FDA decision in 2024 to ban BVO, while a triumph of science and advocacy, arrived decades late. An admission that the U.S. public had been subjected to an unnecessary chemical exposure that their global peers had long been spared. The final ruling, which granted manufacturers a further year to comply, was a recognition of the immense economic inertia built around the ingredient, but it did little to soothe the anger of consumer advocates who pointed to the lost years and the potential unknown health consequences for millions of lifelong drinkers. The ban was the government finally catching up to the scientific and ethical consensus that had existed in Japan for well over a decade.